Welcome back to the class, everyone. One of the best things about Galaxy of Heroes is the large amount of characters it has from a wide variety of different sources. And one of the other cool things is the fact that this list is continually added to week after week and month after month. So what we want to do in today's video, very much in that fashion, is if we could add one character to each and every faction, who would that character be? So as far as overall organization goes for this wish list, we're just going to go in alphabetical order, moving from one faction to the next, seeing what characters would we like to see both from a functional standpoint in game and also just who would be really cool to be able to use. First up, starting off with the 501st, as they are first, is going to be Jesse. There weren't really a lot of great applicants for the 501st, and I feel like Jesse had the most amount of spotlight as far as the Clone Wars series went, outside of the characters that we obviously already have. He could do some really fun things with the 501st, like actually giving them a permanent spot in the top of PvP without necessarily needing to rely on a Datacron, where maybe he could come in with having a TW or a GAC Omicron, where General Skywalker could recover protection before he actually sits down, making the team a lot more of a pain than it is. Not that they need a lifter, but for the sake of the video, we are going to be doing every single faction regardless of where they're at. So Jesse is going to be the first suggestion. Next up is going to be Bad Batch. And this one wasn't hard at all. You're all already probably thinking the exact same thing because it's the obvious choice, and you would be right. It is Crosshair. Very closely beating out Gonk Droid, but still it is going to be Crosshair. Obviously being the fifth for this team. I don't know if he would be a Marquee. Doesn't really feel like Marquee. Maybe more of a Conquest character or a Legendary requiring the 5 Bad Batch. I don't know. Just overall, very cool character that we now have 3 seasons of, and we still don't have his iteration in there. And I realize his alignment kind of messed with that a little bit, but still, it's someone that I would really like to have. Next up is going to be Bounty Hunters. And Bounty Hunters, different from the first two, there are legitimately still a very wide or large amount of Bounty Hunters out there that we don't have in game. But if I had to just pick one right now to instantly add, no questions asked, it would be Dirge. Now, I know Dirge hasn't really seen any live action, but he has been in a lot of other source material, and he's a very cool character. The main place that I know him from was the Clone Wars series that happened back in 2003, where he was just an absolute unit taking on Obi-Wan Kenobi himself and a variety of other characters. And he has had some, not screen time, but he has had some time in other mediums where he's done a lot of really cool things. As to what he would do, I don't know, and I don't really care as long as it's good. Next up is going to be the Clone Trooper faction. Now, we've already touched on the 501st as well as the Bad Batch, but for actual Clone Troopers, if we're wanting to further the faction a little bit more, I would love to see Gregor. Specifically, a 212th Gregor, where he would actually have faction synergy with both Cody and Clone Sergeant. It seemed like CG was trying to make Captain Rex in 3v3 a solution to be able to use these two characters. That didn't actually pan out, as he ends up getting used with other characters. So actually completing the 212th division or whatever they're called would be fantastic. Or even just adding someone so we can get a little bit closer. For Droid, we are actually missing a lot of Droid characters in game because pretty much every single series that comes out has one sitting in there. But to me, Mr. Bones would be the best choice. Pretty much another assassin droid, much like BT1, but in kind of a different style with the B1 style art, or not even art, but his overall design. Next up is going to be Empire. Again, a very large faction that had a ton of options. We were trying to nail it down to just specifically Empire, and I was staying a little bit away from the Imperial Remnant as well as the Imperial Troopers as well as Inquisitors, and we landed on Pelion. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that entirely correctly, but he seems to be a really large fan favorite, especially with the amount of stuff coming out with Thrawn. Next up is going to be Ewok, which again, I feel like this suggestion would never be made if we weren't just simply going through every faction, but we are going through every faction, and that is going to be, I believe her name is Trika, and she was an assassin in the SWGOH games. It kind of feels a little bit underwhelming, and that's not really any offense to her. It just feels like it would be a Princess Nisa Part 2. I did for a second consider adding the Lieutenant, I think it was Quiche, that was in the Rebel X-Wing Fighter series that was used kind of as a prank because it was just a plush Ewok. But at the same time, that was kind of a stretch to be able to fit it into the faction, even though it might have had some fun like tank decoy things going on. Next up is going to be the First Order, who again actually had several different entries that we talked about, but the biggest name out there that we still don't have is going to be Snoke. As to what they would do with him if he were to come into game, I'm not entirely sure. It seems like the second leadership for First Order has been fought over quite a bit between Phasma and TW, Hux, depending on if the enemy team needs turn meter, or even crew. But at the same time, Snoke could take that role, or he could just maybe be his own team where he summons 4 Praetorian Guards. I don't really care. Again, he's just a very big name to not have in the game at all, and that's a bit odd. Next up is going to be the Galactic Republic, again, receiving a lot of additions. But if I just want one really Galactic Republic-y character, what I mean by that is not Jedi, not clone, Galactic Republic, it is absolutely 100% Captain Panaka. Yes, it is not Chancellor Palpatine, it is Captain Panaka. To me, it's really weird we didn't get him to begin with Queen Amidala. While I am a fan of Padawan Obi-Wan and Master Qui-Gon being in the game, there's more slots on that team that can definitely be taken, and it would be great to see him, if not tomorrow, a year from now, or 2 years from now, or something to the extent. Next up is going to be Geos, and I will admit, I completely vetoed our viewership when we were playing out this list. They all wanted the Queen Geonosian as a large unit, but to me, Geonosian Brood Alpha and her essentially have the same exact concept of a kit, of where you would keep on summoning or birthing out new Geonosians that would then be used as fodder for you as the match goes on. So what I went with was just a little bit different, and that is Click Clack. So Click Clack was the main Geonosian that is featured in the Rebel series, and it resembles the survival of the Geonosians after the Empire takes over, and there could be a lot of fun mechanics there with revives and whatnot, showing how he's continuing the lineage. As long as he's alive, all Geonosians will have something to that extent. Next up is going to be Gungans, and this one, I admit, this was actually really hard for us to figure out a Gungan, because all the Gungans that I genuinely want, or like, I guess is probably the better word, are all dark side. And so we were looking to add a light side Gungan, and really we ended up settling on like mounted Gungan, like just a generic, maybe large unit Gungan that could boost the shield generator in some way. We talked about Boss Leone, we talked about that one girl from the Blue Shadow Virus or whatever arc in Clone Wars, and honestly both of those seemed very underwhelming, and I would genuinely rather an unnamed mounted Gungan than those two. Again, I would like a dark side Gungan most of all, but that just really wouldn't fit with what's going on in game. Hutt Cartel, very easy win. Bib Fortuna, lifter character for Jabba, no questions asked. Everybody kind of knows that. Imperial Remnant is once again another just complete freebie. Geothron, no real questions asked. That's probably actually going to happen. This video is not meant as a like prediction list or anything like that, but at the same time, that probably very much will happen. Next up is going to be Imperial Trooper, and this is where things get quite a bit more creative than the last two, and that is actually going to be Creel. Creel is really not that well known of a character, but one of the things that I really want to see with Imperial Troopers is more characters wearing helmets, because when I think of Imperial Troopers, I think of Stormtrooper or Shore Trooper, and while Flame Trooper would be really cool to get, this would add a little more character depth, and at the same time maintaining, again, a character that actually looks like a Stormtrooper, different from, say, Moff Gideon, Iden Versio, or Piet. And he also does some fun things from a lore perspective, so they would have a little bit of flexibility there. Inquisitors had several options of named characters, but for whatever reason, after playing the Cal Kestis games, I really just want Purge Trooper. I think Purge Trooper would be a great addition. We actually already do have them in game. I'm not sure if we have the Electro Staff version. We might just only have the other versions. But the Electro Staff version specifically, or maybe a type of character that can rotate between the several different versions, I think would be cool to add to the team. Realistically, we don't have enough Inquisitors to make 2 teams, even if we did add one more, so I guess it's not really important to have another leader in there quite yet. Next up is going to be Jawa, and this one we ended up going with Tika, which I think was the Jawa from the Obi-Wan series, who essentially, I think she would have some type of extortion mechanic or extortion-like mechanic where she steals 50% of your offense, and then you have to pay a fine and you only get like 30% of it back or something like that. Or maybe you do get your 50% offense back, but she actually gets to keep 20% or something like that for her whole team. I don't know. They're Jawas. I think it'd be fun to do something with them in that regard. Next up is going to be Jedi. Jedi was very, very hard for us to figure out because there are a lot of great Jedi in game. But at the same time, we were able to kind of isolate some of the other Jedi we wanted into either a Rebel category or an Old Republic category, and for just pure Jedi, we actually settled on Jedi Dooku himself. This would be a great addition, particularly for the few Galactic Republic that are still out there that are Jedi who just aren't very good and are really relying on datacrons, specifically pointing out Eve Koth and Kith Fittstow that really just don't have any home in the entirety of the game right now without datacrons, and he could give some space to them if they designed his kit well enough, and also just Jedi Jedi Dooku is pretty cool. Mandalorians were actually really hard to. There are a lot of great Mandalorian characters out there that it would be great to see additions with. We ultimately settled on Pre Vizsla. This was primarily because for dark side Mandos, Maul often can't be used with them, despite the fact that there are some really great dark side Mando synergies with Gar Saxon Imperial Super Commando. So a new leader that would be able to utilize them even better made a lot of sense. Although I will be honest, guys, I put this to a vote. I included Mandalore Ultimate and Pre Vizsla won. So I understand if you like him. I like him too, but this is just kind of where we ended up. Next up is going to be the Mercenaries. This faction, despite the fact that it has a lot of characters, really hasn't been developed as an overall theme yet, since we don't even have a team for them yet. And since Balin's already confirmed, we just kind of settled on Forlom and Zuckuss because Dirge took the bounty hunter spot. So I wanted to give them a shout out somewhere, so this seemed appropriate because they're basically mercenaries. I don't know what is exactly a mercenary. I know they gave us a definition and all, but still. All right, as far as Nightsisters go, I feel like we have all the relevant ones right now. If we could maybe add Morgan's mom, I think her name's Selena or something like that, that would be kind of cool. She went toe-to-toe with Grievous. She did lose, so, I mean, she's not doing too great, but I don't even know what she would do. I don't even know where she would go. Probably with Morgan, who's to say. But again, we're adding one character for every single faction, so just kind of had to get through that. Old Republic, this one was a pretty big debate between two characters. The ultimate winner ended up being Satele Shan. Mitra was the other big one that we had to kind of decide between, and it was very close, but Satele kind of came out on top. And to me, this makes sense from a Galaxy of Heroes perspective because we have Malgus in game, so it really makes sense to have her counterpart, who in my opinion is Satele. Next up is going to be Phoenix. This one for me was wildly obvious, and I wanted this character actually instead of Captain Rex when Captain Rex first came out. Not in as far as kit goes, but overall character representation, and that is going to be Agent Kallus, or Rebel Kallus himself, who ended up switching sides during Rebels. I just loved his overall character arc and his overall realization that the Empire really didn't care about him, and the Phoenix Squadron actually did care about each other. So seeing him as an addition and being added to that unity would be really cool at some point. Next up are going to be the overall Rebels. And again, we also have Rebel Fighters, so we had a little bit of flexibility here. And we actually ended up going with Corran Horn, who, while his identity is actually wrapped up in a few different places, also being a pretty prominent Jedi, he also was a part of Rogue Squadron, which would be a part of the Rebels, and he could probably breathe life into some of the other Rebel fighter pilots like Biggs and Wedge, who really don't have a home after they've been kind of kicked out of the SAW squad for not really being there for that long in general. Speaking of Rebel fighters, we're going to be moving there next, and our character is going to be Nien Nunb, and this just kind of made sense for him to go. I feel like this is where these type of characters eventually end up, and maybe they could finally give him some very specific name synergy with Lando to really elevate Lando to a point where he could be used a lot more, and maybe they end up both on the Sana team, or they both end up on a Mon Mothma team, or they both end up somewhere together where they can actually end up doing something relevant. Next up is going to be Resistance faction, and this one was a little bit hard because we had a few other entries like Rose Tico's sister, who Zara thinks is hot, or as well Mary Poppins Leia, and we ultimately settled for veteran Lando. Lando really doesn't have a lot of great representation in the game right now. He is used on the Jabba squad, but we can't even really see his face in that one. So getting a veteran Lando to able to assist the other two vets that we have in game, all having the Resistance tag, maybe on their own team, maybe with the current Finn Zora team. I'm not entirely sure, but there definitely is a lot of design space where they could do something fun with him, and he would be a great addition to have. Next up is going to be Rogue One, and this one was actually really hard because as far as actual Rogue One members, we already have all the relevant ones and then some. So when it came to picking out a character, we had to be a little bit adjacent to Rogue One and ended up with actually Galen Erso. He definitely was aiding and abetting Rogue One and everything that they were doing, so it made sense to put them together, and honestly just has a pretty cool story, so I wanted to add him in there. Now next up is Scoundrel. And Scoundrel might actually be needing of a overall good host character to take in a lot of the other ones. What has happened over the last couple of years is there are a lot of great Scoundrels and there are a lot of great Scoundrel-esque teams, but ultimately what has happened is they've been boiled into a Smuggler team, or a Bounty Hunter team, or a Hutt Cartel team, or maybe even to a Mercenary team coming up here pretty soon where there's a lot of overlap there. But we don't just genuinely have a good Scoundrel team out there that is pure Scoundrel, that doesn't dip into any of those other thresholds. And the one to be able to hold it all together, to bring it all together, I think would be Talon Card. This is a character from the EU who was a very high level Scoundrel-esque type of character who would have mechanics to be able to give, similar to kind of how Jabba does, where he takes an attacker, a support, and a tank, and utilizes them to the best of their ability, but being just Scoundrel instead of being one of those other factions that we just mentioned. Next up is going to be Separatists. There were quite a few entries for this one that we could have gone with, and we ultimately ended up deciding on our good friend Kalani. And this is a bit weird. I would want him to go with Trench, and I realize Trench has a lot of anti-droid synergy, so maybe they would have to write up some specific things by name, where Trench actually allows them to be used together, because Grievous doesn't really need him anymore ever since Stop entered the game, and Droidica got his Omicron, so maybe that's what they could do. Maybe they could do something else, but I really like Kalani overall as a character. Next up is going to be Sith, and this one, there were a lot of entries, but the one missing puzzle piece that we just don't seem to have right now would be Darth Xana, and the reason why I would like her, and what would be really broken if they did, so maybe they shouldn't do it, but I see her main ability is allowing Darth Bane to work with other Sith on defense. Kind of maybe not doing everything that he does now currently, but unlocking some of those abilities so that he actually has a purpose. Because the issue with her going with him on offense is when Bane takes another Sith on offense with him, he typically wants that other one to die. And I guess that does fit into the rule of two to an extent. He really wants to further power as things go on. So maybe he dies, I don't know. But I'm thinking somewhere in the design space where they could go with her. I would love to have her in game, which is really what we're ultimately going for here. Next up is going to be Sith Empire, where we just kind of end up with Vitiate again. We've talked about this character at length before, so I'm not really going to go into it that deep. Next up is going to be Smuggler, which really has to be Beckett. Beckett is actually the character right now, as far as live action series go, or live action material goes, he is the character with the most amount of lines that we do not currently have in game. He was, or used to be, losing to Jar Jar Binks, and Jar Jar Binks we do now have in game, so it doesn't really count. Next up is going to be Tusken, another character we've talked about a lot before, and that is Darth Krayt. Really more Sith in identity than Tusken, but still, again, if I get to pick one character for each faction, I'm picking Darth Krayt for Sith. I'm definitely doing that every single time. Next up is Unaligned Force Users, coming to the end here, and we ultimately decided on a Dark Side Barriss, and I realize there are a lot of different Unaligned Force User characters we could have picked, but Dark Side Barriss was requested several times throughout this entire preparation for the video, whether as an Inquisitor or a Sith or something like that. Neither of those really fit, so we finally ended up here. And maybe she could be light side, maybe she could be dark side, maybe she could kind of do with both, given what she did in Tales of the Empire. And last and certainly not least is going to be the Wookiee faction, which actually had several entries like Kelnaka or Lobaka, but we ultimately ended up with Gungi, which makes a lot of sense. I think he's been a fan favorite ever since he got a lot more spotlight in Bad Batch, where we found out that he wasn't actually dead. So let me know what characters you would like to see come to Galaxy of Heroes. But until the next time, thank you for watching, and stay awesome.